Hello, everyone. This is James Shore with Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript. You're watching The Lab, which is where we explore, experiment, and generally mess about. And today in the lab, we are continuing our review of AngularJS, the very popular front-end framework from Google. In part one of this series, we looked at fundamentals, templates, controllers, directives, modularity, and testing. Now we're going to look at design and architecture. How does AngularJS affect the design of your application? And how does your choice of architecture and design for your application interact with AngularJS? This ended up being a really big topic, so I've split it into two more parts. Today, in part two of our review, we are going to look at value objects and domain objects. How can you display information from your domain in Angular? And then next time, in part three, we're going to look at custom form fields, interactivity, and communicating information across and around your application. As I said, this is a big topic. Today, we are going to start out with a review of the challenge and what we have done so far with our application. And then we are going to dive into value objects. How can we display the information from our domain in our HTML page? And how does that interact with Angular concepts like scope? Then we'll look at our domain model and how we display things in our row and table. And then we will wrap up with a look at how this affects our review of Angular so far. You can use the timestamps here to jump to sections of interest. As always, the source code is available at the link on your screen. Thanks for joining me, and welcome to the lab. If you've seen my previous reviews, you know that I have 5 pitfalls that I look for in frameworks, 5 common mistakes that frameworks make. The first is lock-in. Many frameworks are designed so that your code only works in their framework, and when they change their way of doing things, or they're no longer popular and you want to switch to a different framework, you have to throw away that big investment. This is actually particularly interesting for AngularJS because between recording this episode and the last episode, the Angular folks announced that they were coming out with AngularJS 2.0. And it appears from, it doesn't exist yet, they're still working on it, but from all indications, AngularJS 2.0 is a brand new framework with a completely different way of doing things. So lock-in is particularly appropriate to consider for AngularJS. But this, of course, happens with all frameworks, which is why it is one of my big pitfalls. We don't want to throw away our investment just because the underlying technology has changed. Second pitfall, opinionated architecture. Can I write the application in the way that I want to, the way that is best for my app, or am I stuck with whatever the framework provides? Third, accidental complexity. When I'm working with a framework, do I get to work on my application's needs, or do I spend my time fighting with the framework? Do I have to spend a lot of effort understanding how and why the framework is working? The fourth pitfall, of course, very interesting to us here in Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript, is the framework testable. Testability is actually not that hard to come by with just vanilla JavaScript, but many frameworks go out of their way, or they seem to go out of the way, to make it more difficult to test your code. So that's something I'm always looking at. And then lastly, always a problem for front-end frameworks, search engine incompatibility. Although search engines, and particularly Google, do index JavaScript, they don't do it very well. They don't do it very quickly. It's not really something you can rely on yet. So is there any way to serve your code from the server? This is also important not just for search engine compatibility, but also for performance. You'd want to have a really good time to first byte. That is time, not necessarily time to first byte. That may not be the right term, but you want the human looking at the page to see something interesting in as quick amount of time as possible. And particularly on the modern web, that's all about latency. So when your HTML comes down, if it doesn't have useful stuff in it right away, you're going to see poor performance. And that relates very closely to search engine compatibility, because this is all about whether or not you can render your app on the server or if it has to happen on the client. So those are the 5 things that I look at when I consider a framework. That's how I evaluate any front-end framework. And that's what we're going to be looking at with AngularJS today. Now, again, the way we're going to be doing this is by actually evaluating how Angular affects the design and architecture of a real application. What we're doing here is we're actually building out an app based on something I did in Java many years ago, a financial projector app. And you can see it here. We mocked this up in the last episode. And today in this episode, what we're going to do is continue this work by actually making it work. Right now, this is all just hard-coded data. It doesn't actually do anything. This application is interesting because it's a bit more complex than your typical to-do app. Let me go ahead and bring up the original here. Here we are. This application is a simulation of a stock market projection. The actual calculations are not so interesting. What is interesting here is the underlying design ideas in it. We're using Ward Cunningham's checks pattern language, which you can find here at the link on your screen. The two of the patterns in particular that we're using are the idea of whole value and exceptional value. And those ideas basically say that we want to turn user input into domain objects as quickly as possible. And we want those domain objects to be able to handle illegal input. What this gives us is the ability to enter invalid data and have our domain model seamlessly handle it, because under the covers, this is represented by something called a user entered dollars, which can either be valid or invalid. And those valid or invalid dollars know how to deal with calculations. So, and invalid dollars, for example, will take any calculation and return another invalid dollars. Anyway, what that gives us is this nice spreadsheet-like view that can handle invalid input nicely. So the question I have is, how well can Angular deal with this unusual architecture? Angular kind of thinks of the domain model as what you put into your scope. So can it deal with a domain model that we've already created? I don't know. I think maybe it can based on the research I've done, but I don't know for sure, and that's what we're going to find out. Let's take a look at the code we have so far. This is all starts out with our index.html. That's this page right here. And the way Angular works is its template, the thing that it actually modifies, is your real HTML. So you can see here we've got ng app. That tells Angular to compile everything inside the HTML tag using its Angular directives. Then we go down into our actual HTML body, and you can see here we've implemented a couple of new tags, configuration panel and stock market table. Those correspond to this piece and this piece respectively. Fundamentally, it seems to me that AngularJS is about two big ideas. One, compiling the HTML DOM or modifying the HTML DOM in place. And two, dependency injection. And the reason they do that is to make it easier to test, or so they say. What I found so far, and what you can see in the last episode, is that it doesn't really make testing easier. And in fact, Angular has a lot of decisions in it that make life more complicated. I'm actually not too thrilled with what I've seen with Angular so far, but what we did in the last episode was a lot of configuration, a lot of setup and figuring out how Angular works. That's always the hard part. So in this episode, as we get into design and architecture, I think we'll get a much better idea of how hard it is to really work in Angular. At any rate, these two tags here are directives. Angular sees these names, configuration panel and stock market table, and it knows to actually apply the code that's here inside of configuration panel.js and stock market table.js. And for information on how exactly that works, check out the last episode. So here's our configuration panel. It's a directive. Its name is what maps to that tag. And we've got some various magic that Angular requires, and then the template. This is the HTML we're going to put into it. And you can see we've nested other directives, a configuration field here, which comes down and turns into these labels and form fields. Similarly, we've got a stock market table that consists of a header and then 3 hard-coded rows. And the rows are just a bunch of table data cells. You can also see in here some of the work I did between recording, just looking at how testing works, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Of course, because this is Let's Code test-driven JavaScript, we do care pretty deeply about test quality and automation. So I do have set up with our Angular code a nice bit of build automation. Now we only have a few tests in here, so it's not doing too much yet, but it is linting all of our code, linting our build code, linting our Angular code, and then running all of our tests. We have 3 UI tests and then all the domain logic that I've brought over is tested as well. And you can see that that runs on all these browsers here. Angular doesn't work with IE8, so I've got IE9, IE10, IE11 working, as well as Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and the iOS simulator. Okay, so that's a brief review of what we have done so far. Now what I'd like to do is to actually get started on the main work of this episode by actually implementing our AngularJS app. The first thing to do, I think, is to turn these table cells into real data. Now, in between episodes, I've brought over all of the domain layer logic that we used in the React review and that I originally ported from the Java application. So you can see we have a domain model here that has our stock market projection and stock market years. These correspond to the projection is the entire table, and each year is going to be a row in the table. And there's a persistence layer, which is going to store user configuration and simulate connections to the server. And there's these value objects, which implements that whole value pattern from the checks pattern language by Ward Cunningham. Dollars, invalid dollars, and valid dollars all represent these dollar amounts. And there's also things like years. The most interesting thing about these value objects is that they know how to render themselves. And they use a somewhat unusual approach to rendering themselves. I've made it kind of intentionally quirky. They all support a render to function, at least the ones that show up in the UI, that you pass in a target, and then that in turn has a render method that's called on it. Now that's really bizarre and not great code. And I understand, I recognize that. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because I want to see how well the framework deals with kind of a bizarre choice. This choice actually made sense for us in the context of the Java application. And although it doesn't really make sense for JavaScript, it does, I think, do a good job of simulating an unusual architectural choice. So every value object knows how to render itself. And what we are going to need to do is to convince Angular to hook that value object up into this table here. So that's the very first thing to do, is to get our value objects to render into the table. Let's go ahead and get started on that. All right, I have our stock market table tests here. This is all sort of experimental code from when I was trying to figure out how testing worked in Angular. See the last episode for those details, but I got to tell you, it was a pain in the butt. A lot of accidental complexity, a lot of stuff that Angular required to be done just right, or it would fail silently. It was not my favorite framework experience ever. In fact, I would say it was probably my least favorite framework experience ever. And I've worked with a lot of crappy frameworks. But Angular has a policy or a philosophy of failing silently in a lot of cases. And man, does that make things hard. Anyway, the way this works is we set up our directive here, and then we ask Angular to compile it with a root scope that it's injected to us, it's handed to us. Then we call digest on that scope, which tells Angular to compile any braces that appear. In our case, we've got this double brace starting balance. Calling digest tells Angular to turn that into its actual value, which starts out at whatever is in the attribute, the balance attribute, which in this case, we've got starting at 42 in the row. But in our test, we don't define it. Since it's not defined, we've got some code that initializes it to 9876, which would then come around and test down here. What we do to get it is Angular implements a sort of jQuery, something called jQuery Lite. It's a subset of jQuery. So we take our element that we've compiled, we find the tr tag, and then we find the td tag in that, and then get the second one out, which is our starting balance here. It's the second cell. Then we look at the HTML and see that it equals 9876, or we can pull it out of the scope, the starting balance variable in the scope, and check that it looks right there. So that's basically how the tests work. Now, it's all just hard-coded, weird data. It was mostly so I could see how to test situations where we change the scope or we deal with events. What we need to do now is actually make this hook up to a real cell or to a real value object. And I think the way I want to do this is I think I actually want to pull out each of these cells as its own directive because that will be easier to test and because that's really what needs to hook up to our value objects. Each cell is going to render a single value object, a year or a dollars, and we need it to render properly. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is factor this out into its own directive, and then we will start test driving it so that it connects to the domain layer. Okay, I've set up a basic test for stock market sell and a do nothing stock market sell file just to get things going. Now, again, the question is, how do we want stock market sell to work? And I do think it's useful to use the test to try to figure that out. So to start with, I guess what we want to do, we want to have some sort of value that we pass in to the cell. Where does that value come from? I'm not entirely clear, but I think scopes are the way that we want this to work. So we'll have some sort of scope set up in the container for cell, which would normally be the row, and we'll want the cell to access that scope. Now, if you're not familiar with Angular, it has this, one of the most confusing aspects of Angular, at least based on the number of articles I see about it, is the way scopes work. My understanding, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but my understanding is that Angular has a root scope, which it creates, and then each directive has the opportunity to create an additional scope, which is a child, a prototypal child, using prototypal inheritance of the root scope, or of the scope that contains it. So you can end up with a scope being a child of a parent scope, being a child of a parent scope, being a child of a parent scope. What this gives is the ability for child directives to see variables that have been defined in the outer aspect of your code. So basically, I can set up my configuration panel so I can see anything that's defined in this example controller div. It's very, very complicated. And I think the reason they did it is so that they could make their two-way binding magic work. But in many cases, I don't think you want your scopes to inherit from each other. So Angular also has the ability to do something called an isolate scope, which you can see here. We can, if we set up our directive to be just the most basic thing, we'll say that it's going to be an entity. It's not going to have anything that we copy over inside the angle brackets, and we give it an isolate scope and a template, which is to say the thing that actually is rendered. This double braces here says create a new scope that inherits from the root scope, but not the scope of the directive that contains it. So I'm thinking that's what, according to the documentation, what you typically want to do for a directive. And it makes sense to me because if you are prototypally inheriting from parent scopes, there's a lot of complexity there. You have to worry about name collisions. It is actually possible to create a property on a child scope before it's created on a parent scope, and then the parent scope and the child scope are not actually connected. Really, it strikes me as a questionable design approach. And maybe that's why they're getting rid of them for AngularJS 2.0. So what I'm thinking is that we want the stock market cell to render a value in the parent scope. And I'm thinking that it's going to look something like TD value equals something. And this TD, this right here, will be the name of the variable in the parent scope. Now, I think Angular is designed to let us do that, but I'm not 100% sure. Let's go ahead and give that a try and see what happens. Okay, I've brought over our example tests and set up just a simple bit of HTML here. This value right here, I believe, is the scope that we are passing in that will be accessible to these elements and specifically to the stock market cell directive here. So what we're saying is that we want to create a table data cell using the stock market cell directive, which is going to come back out here, which means that we need to tell Angular that this is an attribute directive, not an entity directive, not a tag. Although all that does is cause Angular to fail silently if you've got the wrong value in, which is another thing I'm not a fan of. I really dislike Angular's fail silently approach to to directives. So what I'm thinking here is if we pass in, I've told it that the value of the stock market sell is going to be foo. So what I want to do is I want to set up a foo property on a scope. So I think what we need to do is create a child of the root scope and then pass that child in here. And on that child, we will set up the foo element. And then later we want to test that that the value of the cell is equal to whatever value we put in that foo element. All right, the way we create this child scope is rootscope.new, or really anyscope.new. So I can make a parent scope here by taking our root scope and running the new function on it. And now we should be able to pass this parent scope in here, like that. We'll still call digest on the root scope. I think that will cause everything to be digested, because I believe what it does is it recursively descends. So now I think I can just, now that I have this parent scope, I can just set up foo to be whatever value I want. So I'll set it to bar here. And then down here, I should be able to just take our element, find the TD cell, the first one, and expect that the value of that is bar. And this test should fail, because of course we're not doing that yet. Yeah, we expected it to equal bar, but we got undefined. Now making this work, I think, is just a matter, it should be really straightforward. First, let's put the template in here the way it should be. We should be able to basically say whatever value we want. We'll call it value here. And that should be giving us now an empty string rather than undefined, because now we have a TD cell that we didn't have before. Yeah, now we're getting our empty string. So we know that this is rendering properly. Now what we need to do is get the stock market cell to actually look at the foo property of the parent scope. And the way we do that is with the link function. Now there are two functions available to us in a directive. We can create a controller or a linking function. And the documentation is really not very clear on what the difference is. It has a very precise technical definition that requires you to understand all the internals of Angular. But my understanding is that the controller function you create is shared with other directives that are applied to the same element, and the link function is unique to just this directive and element. So controller, unique per element, but shared amongst all directives on the element. Link, unique to the directive and the element. Anyway, the advice I got was use link, not controller, in a directive. So that's what I'm going to do. That is a function. It takes the scope, reference to the element, and then the attributes, which of course we'll need. And then we can put whatever initializing value we want here. So if we said scope dot value equals high, we should now see our test say that we're getting high. And there it is. Great. So now we can tell what value we're getting. Now what we need to do is hook up, we need to hook up this element into our scope. And the way we do that, I think, is we can say that the value should be equal to whatever is inside the variable that is in the value attribute. And we could even do this with a shorthand like this, but I think this may speak a little more clearly. Hey, and that works. Excellent. Okay. And this is the kind of thing, I think this is why people love Angular so much, because once you understand this, this is not a whole lot of code, right? We don't even really need this link function yet. And that just works. You know, it works pretty smoothly, and now that we know how it works, not a lot of effort to make it go. Okay, I feel like we're finally getting a handle on this. And I think the more we get into this, the more satisfied I'm going to be with Angular, because this is pretty nice. I don't love this magic sigil and all this, very specialized stuff, but you only have to learn it once. And now that I am starting to learn it, it's making sense. My brain is getting twisted to be Angularized. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but Now what we need to do is we need to actually hook this up to our value objects. So what I want to do is pass in a real value object and have this render appropriately. Let me just show you how these work. Let's go ahead and take the year. They can convert themselves to strings and they can render themselves. And the simpler approach is just converting to a string. I think that's what I want to start with, because I just want to make sure that we can pass in non-parameters, that we can pass in a real object here. So let's get a year and set it up here. And now what I want to do is, rather than looking for bar, I want to get the value here and expect what we get out of the HTML to be 1984. I expect this to fail, but it may not. It may call toString. No. Yeah, it's dumping out the object. So now what we need to do is have this convert to a string. And can I just run JavaScript in there? I'm not sure. I'm not entirely familiar with how Angular expressions work. Yeah, we can just run JavaScript. So there, done. Fantastic. I feel like we're starting to crack this nut. Now, these value objects, they're not just strings. They can also be negative values and they can be invalid values. So I think the next thing we want to do is make sure that it renders our negative values correctly. But in order to do that, we have to start dealing with this sort of bizarre render_to function that value objects have. And again, as I said in the introduction, this is intentional. Don't write code like this. This is nasty. But it should be interesting to see how Angular deals with it. So let's refactor our stock market cell to get the text out of the render rather than just calling toString on the year. And to do that, I think we're going to have to bring in our link function, because we're going to need more code than we want to put into our template here. So our link function looks like this. And what we want is, I don't think we want to use this automatically. Actually, I'm not sure how that's going to work. Maybe what I'm going to do, let's try saying scope.renderedValue equals scope.value. And here we'll put in rendered value, except we need to convert it to a string. So now we can do the funky rendering thing. What we have to do is call render_to on the year and give it a target. And that target needs a render function. I know, bizarre. And I think I'll just do this in the same way that I did in the React code, which basically have a little linking object. So here's that code. We have got a render target class. It has a render function, and then that stores off the values, and then something that creates the component. That I don't think we're going to want to use, so I'll set that aside for now. Also interesting, I think, is this idea that we're going to create the render target, tell the value to render to that target, and then have the target somehow do the rendering. So here this would be scope.render_to, and then, how is this going to work? Well, to start with, let's just say the rendered value is equal to target.text. And then down here, what we'll want to do is return this .rendering dot, and I believe it is text. The three things we get are text, negative, and invalid. Got a bogus return here, and I don't need that. There. Now, that should work. And it does. Good. Okay, so now we've got this using the actual value object rendering, the ability of the value objects to render themselves. Next, we want it to render values that are negative. And I think the easiest way to do this would be to just create a negative dollar amount. So we're going to do the same basic thing, and I'll want to factor this out in a few minutes. But now, we'll say new valid dollars, -30. The value here is going to be dollars. And here we expect it to render like this, I believe. Really, it's going to be whatever parent scope dot dollars dot toString is, which I think uses a parenthesis. Okay, and that worked okay. We also need, the way negatives work is with a class, so we need that to render, we need to render the negative values with the negative class. So we'll expect the cell to have the class negative. That should fail because it doesn't have that class. Good. And then if I come into here, I want to set up the template to always have that class. Now how do I do that? Well, maybe this is where the link function comes in, because as Martin Grandroth in the chat said, the link function is what you use to manipulate the DOM. So here, do I want to say that if render target is negative, we'll add the negative class to the element? Or rather, let's just add the negative class to the element all the time, because that would make our test pass. And it does. Of course, we don't want it to always render negative. So what we need to do here is say that a positive value should not have that negative class. That should fail. It does. And now I should be able to say if target is negative, add the class. And down here, we can return whether or not that rendering is negative. Now I think there's a better way of doing this. I think we can possibly have this render target code work much more nicely with Angular, but I want to get the basics in first before we start doing that. So I think this will pass. Should now be rendering positive values as positive and negative values as negative. And it appears that it is. Good. So that is a basic, if ugly, implementation of a value object. And it was pretty painless, I have to say. I'm not sure if we're doing it in the most Angular-y way or if it's the most appropriate way. Both the tests and the production code are still pretty ugly. I think they can be a lot better. But so far, I'm feeling like Angular is handling this situation pretty well. Now, there's a couple of things that we still have yet to do. We need to make sure the text is sanitized. And also, we need to make sure the binding is working. We will look at that as well. But first, I want to just hook it up in the actual page to make sure that although the tests are working, I'm not 100% confident that the code actually works. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and be back in a moment. Okay, I've been trying to get the stock market row to use our new stock market cell. And to start out with, it was fairly straightforward. I set up our scope.year to define the scope. And then I passed it through into our stock market cell. But when I actually run it, I get this scope.value is undefined. And unfortunately, that's all we have. Now I have tracked this down. It is failing right here. So scope.value is undefined. That value should be getting initialized with whatever is in the value attribute, which we are defining right here. And we are setting it up here. So there's clearly something going wrong with the way I'm setting up the scope, this stock market row's parent scope. What it is, I don't know. I'm going to look into it a little bit more and be back in a moment. Okay, I figured it out, and I've also finally figured out the difference between controller and link. I found it purely by luck. I thought it might be scope related, so I took out this isolate scope and reran everything. And what happened was that our first row still had no year showing up, but the later ones did, which was odd. But I know because the way this works, if we take out this isolate scope, that means that our scope is now defined by the parent. And in this case, that's this div right here. So this has created a scope that's sharing, or maybe it's the stock market table. Regardless, that row's scope is now shared across all the rows. So the fact that we're getting nothing here and then a value in the following ones means that this line of code is rendering after this template. So what that means is that link is the wrong function to run here. Now, the documentation is not clear on this at all. Instead, it talks about it says you should use link over controller and directives, and and controllers are shared across directives. It was very unclear. But basically what I have learned from this is that if I do controller here, it does work. We'll change this to scope so it will do its dependency injection properly. And in fact, if we want to not have that be destroyed by minification, we should do it that way. And we'll need the $sign there. Rerun that. And now it's working. So controller, it runs before the template is compiled. Link runs after the template is compiled. And that probably is in the documentation, but it just wasn't clear. There were so many other words talking about so many other things. So the takeaway I get from this, and I don't know if this is 100% correct, but the takeaway I have is that all of your scope manipulation should go in the controller, and your DOM manipulations, particularly events and so forth, should go in the link function. And I'm still not clear why it's advised that you use link and not controller, because I did some tests between episodes, and I know that the controllers, any variables you set in the controller are not shared with other instances of the same directive. Why not just use controller for everything? I don't know. I'm sure there's a reason. It's another example of accidental complexity in Angular, though. They've got two very similar things that behave in very slightly different ways. And I think that's a real failing in Angular, that it has so many cases where there's two things that are very similar, used for mostly the same things, but have to be used for just a little bit in just a little bit different cases. Their controller as syntax is another example of that. At any rate, now we can set up the rest of our values. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a bogus starting balance, cost basis, and so forth, and we'll see how that comes out. All right, that solved it. Now that we've got the controller in, everything's working just fine. And I've gone ahead and put in the dummy data that I've just pulled out, put in an invalid dollars in there too, and you can see everything is rendering just as it should. So that is fantastic. Now what I want to do is just take care of some more cleanup. I think I'm going to start out by doing the double binding, or really it's just one-way binding. But I want to be able to change the value of the field and see that the cell changes when it should. So let's go ahead and do that. We should say it updates cell when underlying value changes. Now, this is a big part of Angular's magic. How does it work? I'm not sure. Will it work? I'm not sure. I know it will work with simple scope values, but will it work with our value objects that don't connect directly to Angular? I'm not sure. I think they will. I think Angular's designed so it will. I think that's one of the reasons it's popular, but haven't tried it yet. Let's go ahead and give it a shot. Let's take just a simple value here, simple test here. And again, I still need to clean up these tests. We'll create the year, do all of that, and then we'll change the year. Now these years are all immutable, or all the value objects are immutable, which means that we don't change the data inside of the value object. We just make a new value object. So if that updates properly, that should work. We'll need to bring over our cell. There we go, it's failing. We expected 2001, but we got 1984. Now, I think we can make this work. Well, I'm not sure. Do we need to tell it to apply the changes? Maybe. Let's just try that and see what happens. No, that didn't do it. Do we need to tell it to digest again? Maybe. Nope, still doesn't work. Okay, I'm going to investigate this. Back in a few. Okay, Scott Corrigan in the live stream chat clued me into scope.watch. This will run a function whenever a value in the scope changes, and we pass in the value as a string here. And I've confirmed that this does work. If we run this high log statement and we only run this one test, we get two highs out. I'll show you here. So you can see it coming out here. So it's running every time we run digest. So what that means is that we should be able to put all of this code inside of a watch. Now, does that mean that this is running asynchronously? If it does, that means this is going to be a royal pain in the ass. So let's hope it's not. No, it's not running asynchronously. It did work. I think we've got it. Yeah, that is looking really, really solid. So now we know that it updates the cell when the underlying value changes. That's fantastic. Code's a little bit ugly, but not too bad. And part of it's just the nesting from scope.watch, but a lot of it's just from having all this crap. I think the next thing I'd like to do, we are pretty much done with getting value objects to render in our table, and it's working really well. We can now render any value objects, including evil ones, safely. I'm not super happy though with the way this code is written, and I think we can make it better by moving more responsibilities into this render target. So I'm going to go ahead and see if we can clean that up. What I'm thinking is that we should be able to do something like say that we want a new render target and then ask the scope to render to that target. And when we create the render target, what if we just passed in the element? And that is a lot cleaner. So we've now nicely isolated our rendering details from our directive logic. Not that there's a whole lot of it. The only real directive logic is this watch function. And we have some very nice tests here as well. I am pretty happy with this code, and Angular did not give me nearly as much trouble as I expected it to. In the last episode, when we were doing a lot of the initial figuring out of Angular, man, I spent hours sometime just trying to figure out why Angular wasn't working. This time, the only real issue was with watch related to the binding. That could have been a lot worse. Thanks again to Scott Corrigan in the chat for cluing me into that. But it definitely could have been a lot worse. I feel like this code is pretty nice. I still dislike the magic sigils that Angular provides, or uses. But overall, this is pretty good. Now that we have the stock market cell working, and I am really happy with this, I think the next thing to do is to do the same for our stock market rows and the stock market table. Okay, I've got a basic beginning of a stock market row test here. What we do is we're setting up the stock market year. Again, each of these rows is represented by the stock market year domain object, and the whole table is represented by the stock market projection domain object. And these domain objects are the things that actually know about capital gains tax and everything else. So I've set up a stock market year, and I've created a row just like we do in the table cell test. We're doing a table body tr stock market row directive with the value of this year. Then I compile it and digest it and find the row. So I've created that row. Now the question is, how do I test this? Because what I want to test is that this code is written properly. I don't want to have to know how this code works. I don't want to know how rows are rendered. That's not my problem. My problem is rows. Cells has its own test. That worries about how cells are rendered. I don't want to have to worry about it. And most importantly, I don't want our test to break when the cell rendering changes. So is there a way to test that? I mean, ideally what I'd say is expect row to contain TD stock market cell value equals year. Can that actually be done? No, I don't think so. So how do I want to do it? Okay, I have a way of testing this that's not too bad. What it does is it takes an expected rendering and compares it to the actual rendering. And that solves the problem of having to know what's going on inside of the cells. It's not terribly clean, unfortunately. We have to pass in the expected rendering, then the name of this property, and then the expected value. Because the way this works, when we render the cell, we actually have to create a whole new scope that we put the expected value on to a property. So when it compiles it, that this year hooks up to this value. So it's not super clean. None of the frameworks I've really delved into so far have had a nice way of comparing an actual rendering to a component version of what we're expecting. They all turn it into real HTML, and then you have to compare the HTML. Also, the output that we get from this is not too pretty. Here it's not so bad where we're just looking at the table, the TD, but when we start looking at the entire stock market table, it's going to get pretty ugly. But anyway, this is working, and it is failing for the right reason. We're getting 2010, but we expect 1984. So now what I should be able to do is go into our stock market row and have this connect to the year. Okay, we've got that stock market row implemented, and it's looking pretty good. The tests are pretty straightforward. We're just comparing each cell to the directive we want to have for that cell, and then we have hard-coded a bunch of expected values. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this code. It's a bit verbose in that we have to repeat all this here and here, and it would be really nice if I could just say value.year right here inside of the directive, but I wasn't able to find a way to do that. It could be that Angular has a way to do that. They have ways to do all kinds of stuff, but I wasn't able to find it with a little bit of poking around, and nobody in the live stream chat had any ideas either. So I think this is the best we can deal with for now. Okay, I have finished the stock market table as well. That's all test driven, and I've updated our example app to put in some dummy data. So you can see here a real stock market projection being rendered by our table directive. The stock market table was fairly straightforward, but not quite as straightforward as I would have liked. The major new idea that was introduced here was the concept of ng repeat. This is basically how you do how you repeat an element over and over again as you use the ng repeat directive. And what we do here is we say that we want to repeat on the year variable in the years collection, and then these two strings need to match. Again, Angular really likes its magic strings and having them match up appropriately, but at least we have tests around it, so we know if we accidentally break something. This years has to be a collection, but of course our domain model is based on the stock market projection, which is an object, not an actual collection. So what we have to do is we have to create an array and then loop through that projection and copy it into the array. It's a little bit clunky. It's really clunky because of our code, though, not because of anything wrong with Angular. We ended up doing the exact same thing with React. It's just the nature of the way our domain model works. But Angular handled it just fine. Something that was more Angular's fault, we weren't able to compare our directives like we have before. So if you look up here, you can see we've got this check directive where we're checking that the first row of the table matches a specific value. Specifically, we want it to be the first year. We couldn't compare the HTML of the rows because our row now has this ng repeat directive on it, and that we can't put that in our expected value because there is nothing to repeat and it would throw an exception. So what I ended up doing was comparing the inner HTML. This technique that we have of comparing directives or comparing HTML, it's not a great approach. It's the same one we ended up using in React. Neither approach is great, but it's worse in Angular because Angular puts in a lot more junk in the DOM that ends up making these comparisons not work. I think comparing the inner HTML is more likely to be okay, but it's still pretty clunky, and now we're not checking things that might end up mattering. That finishes up everything we needed to do in order to get our table hooked up to our domain model. So we now have everything properly rendering value objects and getting data out of our domain model and reacting to the domain model appropriately. So if we were to change the way the domain model worked or the value objects worked, the UI would not have to change, which is the whole point of having a strong separation between domain and UI. And of course, to implement this, I made no changes to the UI code. It was originally manually transpiled from Java by me, used in React, and now it's being used in Angular with no changes whatsoever. All that we've had to change is the way that we connect the two through our render target adapters. So to sum up, it was fairly straightforward, but I'm not thrilled with it. If we start at the top with our stock market table, you can see the stock market table has a stock market row directive in it, and we pass through this value attribute. The way that comes through is through the scope. So in our stock market row, you'll see equals value in our scope. That's obscure. I mean, once you know Angular, it makes sense, but I still have a little trouble describing what's going on there. And then similarly, the stock market row has stock market cells with a value. And again, that comes through here. And then this magically hooks up to the value to whatever is provided in that attribute that is on the outside scope. And I think that's what makes this hard to understand. In order to make sure that our code automatically updates when that value changes, we put a watch on it. So we say scope.watch, and then we watch our value, which will automatically change when the one that's provided in the attribute changes. And then of course we re-render here, or in the case of the row, we update our values, or in the case of the table, we redo all of our rows, all of our collection data. Testing this has also been fairly straightforward. The main thing has been the way we compare directives. And again, that seems to be a problem in all the frameworks we've worked with so far. They may support components, but they don't really support components as first-class citizens in your tests. So how is Angular performing on our pitfalls? Well, not too bad, but not great either. Lock-in, yeah, pretty much anything you build for Angular will only work with Angular. And from all reports, it won't even work with Angular 2.0. Opinionated architecture, we actually has not been as bad as I expected. We did run into some problems last month in last month's episode. I've been pleasantly surprised by how easy it has been to get the value objects and domain objects to display, but actually getting data back into the domain layer is a whole nother question, and we will look into that next month. So the jury is still out on opinionated architecture. Accidental complexity has not been great. There has been a lot of complexity in Angular. I'm looking forward to seeing how that works out as we get into the more complicated things that we're going to get into next month in terms of events and cross-application communication. Testability, I have been surprised at how poor the testability is given Angular's emphasis on testability. Their testability, though, really seems to be geared around dependency injection of their global services and actually testing directives as HTML components isn't really there. For example, when we were doing our rows and our tables, I really wanted to be able to test that a table contained rows and a row contained cells, but we don't have that ability. We can only look at the HTML. So that was surprisingly poor given how much Angular likes to talk about the importance of testability. And then finally, search engine compatibility and server-side rendering. That's just not something that Angular provides. And with that, we've got everything working in our table connecting to our domain model. The next thing to do is to look at events, our configuration panel, and how everything communicates across the application. We'll take a look at that next month. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.